Hello and thank you very much for watching this video. I have another question regarding the auth flow, and that is what would be the correct approach if you would like to expose an endpoint for registering users in the DB. And that's actually a very good question and a strong one, and there is not one approach for doing that. You have to choose depending on your application and depending on your system, but I will try to give you some options for doing that. So that the endpoint should be out of security reach, that's for sure a no. You should have no endpoints that are unsecured on your application, so you have to find a good way of securing that endpoint. I know what you think. What is if I want my users to register themselves, then they should have a user to be able to create a user, and that's not possible. Of course, that's not logic, but you have to find another way to have at least a part of the security of access of the endpoint itself. So you can't leave completely the endpoint unsecured and available for everybody. That would actually mean that anyone could then add the users in your database or change your database, and you don't want things like this to happen. So should you do registering on the authentication server, since the other microservices have different databases? Yes, somehow the user should get into the database of the authentication server. That can happen directly, like adding the endpoint and just registering the user directly in the authentication server, if that's possible. But you have also the opportunity of using the other microservices to do some other things in between, like for example when you do multi-factor authentication and you want your user to also provide a code that was generated and sent via an SMS message, or maybe via an email message with a link or something like this. There are a lot of opportunities here that you should take into consideration. So for example, you have the possibility here. I have just a paint that's easier for me to describe and to draw while I speak. This is the authorization server. So here you have the database with your users. So there is the chance that the users will be added somehow with a back office application. So in this case, if you have a back office application, then there's no actually a problem, because that application would somehow be accessible only in the intranet of your organization. So in this case, you would have probably an admin role that has this authority of adding new users. So in this case, the user won't register itself. You would register the user, somebody from the organization would register the user, and then the user would be able to connect from the client. This is the client here. So that's the easiest thing. Now the most difficult thing is, of course, and I believe that's your question, about what happens when you want the users to register themselves. And again, here you have the option to directly register it through the authorization server, but you also have the possibility to try doing that through the resource server. And in this case, it's a little bit more complicated, because you should have somehow the possibility of exposing a resource with another kind of authentication than the normal authorization server authentication. And what could happen in this situation is that, for example, if this is actually if this is just a mobile application, you could have a key that is provided to the client whenever it's registered in the authorization server, and then anyway when you call something on the authorization server, you would have to provide the client ID and secret, and that's actually the credentials of the client itself. So in order for a user to be able to register, then anyway at least the client should be a client that was registered here. So even if the user doesn't have yet a username and the password, because that's the mean of the registration to be provided with something like this, then at least the client will have to use its credentials anyway to authenticate. So you at least know that is one of the applications that are registered. So that's one layer of security. And the other one would be actually to have, for example, a secret key that is provided to the client beside the client ID and secret, and that key can be used to sign messages to specific endpoints. So that way, even if you provide in the network, for example, the credentials in order to access a specific endpoint via, I don't know, HTTP basic or something like this, you could still have a key that will never be shared in the network with these messages, and that will only be used to sign your requests. So signing the request, then the server can be implemented such that if the correct signature is on the request, then the request is approved, and if it is not, then the request is not approved. And what do you actually sign? Well, you can use a unique identifier of the application installation. So in that way, you could impose measures of not allowing one specific application just to call infinitely your endpoint and to do some spam on your server. So you can then check that the signature is correct, but you can check based on the unique identifier of the installation as well, so that a call is not repeatable, or it is repeatable in a certain amount of time or something like this. So you can impose this kind of rules to make sure that you don't somebody doesn't try to get your system down. And of course, nowadays you see that always with this kind of registrations by the user, you always have to provide a phone number or at least an email address, but nowadays you do it with the phone number, and you get an OTP generated, and then you have to explicitly type that code, and that will be sent through the request. And only if you have that proper code that was sent through the SMS message, then you will be able to access the registration endpoint. And then when you do something like this, you will call practically a third-party service in order to send that SMS for you, like for example the SNS service in AWS. And then based on that, if that's the correct code that was provided, you do the registration. So you make sure in this way it's much more difficult for a user to try to create a lot of users in your system, because each user will be actually linked to a phone number. I hope this at least answers some of your question. Again, this is an architectural question. It really depends on the kind of system that you are developing. Is not something like you should do it like this. There are a lot of ways, just some of the possibilities I have told you, and the only thing that you really have to respect, so the only thing that's really important is never leave an endpoint completely unsecured. That's for sure. That will not happen in any case of a system. But regarding the implementation itself, depending on your system and depending what your system does, you will have one or another way of registering the users in your application. Again, I hope this at least answers part of your question. If I can be more clear on a specific situation or specific case scenario, please let me know. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and stay tuned for new questions and answers.